This is just a quick revision video that goes through some of the agreements that were made in the 1920s that undermined the League of Nations. Now, these 4 pacts and treaties that were signed in the 1920s are easily forgettable, but it is important that we remember them because they could come up as a source-based question, as number 3, the account question, or it might be relevant for you to bring it in as number 4 if you get a 16 markup on the League of Nations and how it failed. Now, I've already made a video on the League of Nations and how certain events in the 1920s and 1930s undermined it. Now, the League of Nations was formed in 1920, but without major players such as the USA. This weakened the League when it came to deal with international crises such as the Manchuria crisis, Abyssinian crisis, and certain other events that we've also looked at in the 1920s as well. Now, we're going to look at 4 other agreements that were made in the 1920s. Now, really what we need to have at the back of our minds is, if the League of Nations was so strong, then why did these other agreements need to be made? We're going to start with the 1921-22 Washington Arms Conference. Okay, so background for the Washington Arms Conference. One of the aims of the League was to encourage disarmament, but significantly, it was not involved in the first international arms conference. The Washington Arms Conference was organised and held in the USA. Remember, the USA were not a member of the League. Now, the main aims of the treaty were that major countries like Britain, France and Japan were to attend. They would agree and decide that Britain and the USA could have the same size navies, whilst for every 5 tons of each of their battleships, Japan could have 3 tons. Now, the significance of the treaty was that Britain, France and Japan attended as individual countries rather than sending representatives through the League. It shows that attitudes and priorities as early as 1921 were for themselves rather than the League. Now, it's so important to remember that Russia left the First World War in 1917 due to a communist revolution. As a result, they were subject to a very harsh treaty that was forced upon them by Germany. Now, we forget this because this was a year before Germany had lost the First World War. However, by 1922, the 2 countries had effectively reconciled with the Rapallo Treaty. So the background to the Rapallo Treaty was that Russia was forced to leave the First World War in 1917. They had to surrender to Germany and had vast quantities of land taken away. Russia had to pay large quantities of reparations to Germany. This original treaty that Russia was forced to sign was known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Now, the main aims of the treaty was that representatives from Germany and Russia would meet in Rapallo, Italy, to sign the treaty. It was agreed that Germany would return the money and land that Russia had originally lost in Brest-Litovsk. The 2 countries would cooperate in the future. Now, as a side note, the Rapallo Treaty is very important because what it does is that it enables Hitler, much later into the 1930s, to build a Luftwaffe. When we think back to the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, Germany were not allowed to have an air force. But by the 1920s, many ordinary citizens were using commercial aeroplanes to fly around for business meetings, if they were rich enough to fly to the south of France on holiday. So Germany and Russia, as part of the Rapallo Treaty, enabled Germany to build commercial aircrafts. And it's quite possible that many of these commercial aircrafts will later be used by the military to form the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in the 1930s. Therefore, the building of a German Air Force and the rolling back of that particular term of the Treaty of Versailles was not completely down to the Nazis. It had started as early as 1922. Now, the next pact that we're going to look at is very important because it was signed just as Germany were finding their feet again after the 1923 economic crisis. France had invaded the Ruhr, where Germany had not been able to afford the £6.6 billion reparations. So France had come in and taken what was really the heartland of the German steel industry. The Locarno Pact was signed. Now, the background to the Locarno treaties was that in 1923, Germany had struggled to pay the reparations that had been imposed upon them by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which had blamed them for the First World War. France entered the Ruhr, which was the heart of Germany's steel industry. This started the Ruhr crisis and hyperinflation, which made German currency worthless. So for example, if German citizens had savings, they lost everything overnight. In 1925, the German Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann invited the French Foreign Minister to meet and sign a treaty to help improve relations between the two countries. The meeting was held independently of the League of Nations, as Germany was not allowed to be a member. Now, the terms of the treaty was that Germany accepted the borders by the Treaty of Versailles, but France also had to respect Germany's borders and never invade the Ruhr again, even if Germany were to struggle with the reparation payments. Countries agreed to work peacefully together to settle disputes. The treaty was also signed by Britain, Italy, Belgium and Czechoslovakia. Now, the significance of the treaty was that it was meant to be an end of German resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles. Germany now had a new image of a peaceful nation rather than the aggressors from the First World War. Germany was allowed into the League of Nations the following year, 1926. And finally, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The main terms of the Kellogg-Briand Pact was that 65 countries met in Paris and they signed a treaty stating that they would not use war as a way to solve disputes. The first countries to sign it were Germany, France and the USA. Now, two of them were not members of the League of Nations. And the significance of this treaty was that individual countries acted independently of the League. The League looked like it was just a place for countries to air their problems and not a place where practical solutions could be found. Again, these agreements are easily forgettable, but it's really important that you include them in your revision. Meanwhile, if you have found this video helpful, please do like, subscribe, and I hope to make another one for you soon. Good luck.